Go home, Google Translate. You're drunk.
Hello everyone, I'm Kevin, otherwise known as Forum BX257, here to bring you another 1980s G.I. Joe tour review. And today I'll be taking a look at G.I. Joe Samurai Warrior, the 1988 Budo. Now Budo, like a lot of 1987 and 1988 characters, did not make any cartoon appearances, but he makes his first comic book appearance in the old Marvel comic run of G.I. Joe in issue number 82.
Before I begin this review, I'd like to note that I am incorrectly pronouncing his code name. In Japanese, it would be pronounced Budo, with the emphasis on the second syllable. Bu meaning martial, and do meaning a path, where sometimes Budo is translated as martial arts, but being a path, or a path in life, is a much more personal element to martial arts. So it really should be translated as martial artist. Taking a look at Budo's accessories, he comes with what the contents list on the card calls an ornamental sword. You can see that it's actually hooked up onto his waist there with a sculpted peg. Like 1987 Gung Ho and the Iron Grenadiers, he comes with a sword which is permanently fixed in its sheath. However, unlike those figures, he also comes with what's called a crimson sword. No explanation actually given as to what that means, but, well, there it is. This looks a lot like the 1988 Storm Shadow sword, which I will get to in just a moment to compare. He also comes with what's called on the contest list samurai headgear. It's a removable helmet, although they're not calling it a helmet for some strange reason. It's really nicely painted there, with some nice sculpted detail. His backpack has places for both the sword and his sai. The sai is actually very unusual in its design. And now for a closer look at the backpack. It's kind of a fancy design, except for the top here, which has a whole bunch of grenades. You also notice that the pegs for the sword and the sai are actually different. The pegs on this side are actually squared off because of the more rectangular nature of the blade, whereas the pegs here are actually rounded in the middle for the more rounded blade of the sai. I do wonder whether the placement of the sai on the backpack was a last-minute decision, because there is a ring, just like the ornamental sword, on the end of the sai, so you could actually place that by his side instead of the sword. I have to admit, while I don't often appreciate the sort of over-stylized, very non-military looking figures, I actually do kind of like what they have done, or what they've actually tried to have done with this figure. I mean, samurai armor is actually quite flashy, and yet they've given him a very subdued earth tone, very military looking color scheme. I mean, sure, there are pops of red, but those would have actually been a very common thing on samurai armor. Not like these browns and dull greens, certainly. But there are a few things which are very odd about the figure. Like the helmet, for instance, is not your traditional samurai design. Yeah, you have those long back flaps and the horns, but then you have this nose guard Normally a samurai helmet would actually have a brow across it, not a nose guard. The figure itself actually has a very interesting hairstyle. It's a little bit hard to see, but what he's actually wearing there is not your traditional top knot, but actually what's called a chonmage, which is where the ponytail actually is folded back up around and over the head. So basically the tail of his ponytail is actually in the front here, and it's actually kind of tied back here. That's a very interesting thing to do. Again, the top knot is actually a fairly traditional thing, sort of like how you would have on the 1987 Zanzibar figure, but they didn't go with that. One thing which is a really kind of annoying and not really a feature of just this particular figure, but a lot of figures from 1988 and 1989 is the entire chest is just molded in one color with no paint whatsoever on it. I understand that that was a cost-cutting feature because he does have a lot of paint all over him. Like his gauntlets here have these little ruby insets, and he has all types of paint all over his knees and stuff like that. And like I said, while I appreciate what they've been doing here, there are a few very odd things, like the fact that his sword attaches onto his backpack. Now, while it's great that he has storage for all three of his weapons, the fact of the matter is that a samurai should not have any weapons on his back. Now, you know the traditional Japanese greeting where, you bow. Well, the reason why they bow is to show that they don't have weapons hidden on themselves, specifically hidden on their backs, which is something a ninja would do, not a samurai. Here I put a bit of blue tack on his waist just to show you exactly what he would have looked like had he had a hook on both sides of his waist. And personally, I think that looks really good. It's just a shame that they didn't implement that. Now, normally I let you, the viewer, read the file card yourself, but there's a few things that I wanted to point out here, because I think that this is written by Larry Hama, who probably has a better grasp of Japanese culture than the people who had actually sculpted and designed Budo here. Not to say that there's anything wrong with the stuff which is on Budo. It's just a matter of modernization and reinterpretation, which you can sort of get away with some of the things which I might have complained about. But there are a few things which are very interesting here, such as the haiku in the middle. While that's really cool and all that, it also mentions that the haiku was written by one of his ancestors. So I'm kind of wondering whether the English interpretation would have actually have kept the haiku timbre. I'm not quite sure that it would have. There's also a very interesting little thing here, saying that he had practiced probably many martial arts here, but it specifically mentions Aikido, which is more of a combat Zen swordsman martial art. Now, samurais are very stereotypically they practice Aikido, which is it's almost like a type of fencing. And it does mention that his grandfather was a fencing master. So Aikido, even though it's very stereotypically associated with samurais, is more of a dueling, points-based martial art where both the attacker and the opponent have to play by certain rules, which is not really a very combat-like, realistic combat-like swordsmanship martial art, whereas Aikido actually is. And now for the comparison I'm sure you've all been waiting for. It is Budo versus Storm Shadow, specifically the 1988 Storm Shadow released in the same year as Budo, which always kind of fascinated me because when you think about it, neither the file card nor any media, like the comic books, they don't have any mention of these two ever working together or associated with each other or talking about each other, which is very strange because a samurai is the traditional enemy of the ninja and vice versa. So you would think that, some sort of play on hostilities between the two characters would ensue or be a very interesting plot point, but no, you don't get anything like that. What's also very interesting between the two is that they both have red swords. And it's not explained why Storm Shadow has a red sword, and it's not explained why Budo has one either. Although Storm Shadow's red sword is simply called a sword, whereas Budo's is specifically called a crimson sword. As strange and old-fashioned as Budo may seem to be, if you ignore his samurai warrior combat title, and refer to his actual military specialty as hand-to-hand combat specialist, it actually makes quite a bit of sense that he does have a few figures to be opposed to in the 1988 range, such as the Dreadnought Road Pig, who is definitely not a combat, long-range combat military arms type of figure to deal with. So a hand-to-hand combat specialist such as Budo would be an obvious match against this guy. There is, of course, yet another figure, released in 1988, and that is the Iron Grenadiers. So while, yes, they did have firearms and such, they also carried a sword, which would be a very interesting match against a samurai. And of course, how could I forget somebody from the same era as the samurai? Pirates, specifically the 1987 Dreadnought Zanzibar. If you're looking for a Budo figure on the aftermarket, he is fairly easy to find, complete with all of his accessories, and for a fairly cheap price. He isn't a very popular figure, which always kind of makes me laugh because a lot of people like the ninjas and stuff like that, but not the samurai for some strange reason. Even though he is fairly well equipped and, like I said, a fairly detailed figure. If there's anything that you really have to look out for on the figure, it's really his painted hands, as they can be scratched off fairly easily. There's also the rings on both his ornamental sword as well as the sai. They can be kind of broken if you don't attach these things very carefully to his hook. They can just kind of split or crack off. But other than that, he is a fairly sturdy figure, and you should find him fairly easily on the aftermarket.
G.I. Joe Samurai Warrior. Serious face.
Here, I put a bit of, as Budo actually seems to be, he actually can go up quite against. Well, that's all the time I have right now. Please check out my Facebook page for more information and behind-the-scenes photos for these reviews. Thank you for watching this video, and stay tuned for next time to see another 1980s G.I. Joe toy review. See you then.